Hello everyone, and welcome to another Thriveabetes video. And today I'm with Síofra Kelleher, who is from Sligo, but she is just about to go into third year in UCC down in Cork. And Siofra was diagnosed in 2010 at the age of 10. And shortly after that, she was diagnosed with celiac disease. So we're hoping to touch on celiac and diabetes during the course of our interview. Siofra is now 21, and Siofra and I have crossed paths, but this is actually the first time we've talked face to face since we've known cross paths, I suppose, in 2015. And how that came about is an interesting story. So Siofra and her dad were attending Web Summit representing Coda Dojo, and my husband Phil volunteers with Coda Dojo and happened to be at Web Summit because he is involved in the IT sector. And he stumbled across Siofra and a dad, and lo and behold, they started to talk about diabetes, and Phil connected the dots and then passed contact information. And I think I connected with your dad, John, first about DIY when me and him were relaunching that. And then we connected over social media. So Siofra, thank you so much for doing this today and for bearing with me in that long-winded introduction. And I'm going to hand it over to you to, let's start your story because we have a lot to talk about today. Let's start your story with diagnosis and at age 10 and how that manifested for you.
Well, I suppose I was diagnosed on the 14th of September in 2010. So I was 10 years old. And what I found funny about my diagnosis is that you could see it coming on during the summer. I had sort of funny symptoms at first where I was very cranky all the time and very tired, but I seemed to have sort of gained weight. I was always a very skinny child and I looked sort of chubby. you can see it in our holiday photographs. But then when I went into fourth class that year, I think it was the third day, I was running out to the playground. I fell over and I really hurt both my knees. And I suppose like many diagnosis stories, I hurt both my knees and they seemed to be going well, healing well. But then as the week went on, all the classic symptoms of type 1 diabetes set in. So thirst, tiredness, needing to go to the bathroom. I was still very cranky. Yeah. So evidently I had very high blood sugars. And then my knees seemed to be healing. And then out of nowhere, seemed to have gotten infected. At this point, I had already gone into the GP because we believed that I had a flu because of all my symptoms. And I had like an antibiotic. It wasn't working. My knees got infected. We knew something was really wrong at this stage. So when I went into my GP the second time, he took one look at me and he knew, okay, something's wrong. This isn't the flu. And he guessed pretty much immediately that it was probably type 1 diabetes. So I suppose, like most people, I did a urine sample test. Yeah. It was the old school with the colors, no numbers, but I was very, very high. So I was brought into hospital immediately, into Sligo Sligo University Hospital now, actually. Sorry. Yeah. And so I pretty much the first day I went in, I was able to go straight into the pediatrics ward because I had gone to my GP beforehand. And same day they diagnosed me with type 1 diabetes.
How was it? How was that news delivered to you? Can you remember? And just tell us a little bit about your stay in hospital.
I can't remember. I think I was about an hour or two in hospital. And my endocrinologist, Dr. Gleason, he was fantastic. He was such a brilliant doctor and I really miss him. He really believed in treating, I suppose, children on like an equal level and feeling that there is a lot of things that a child can cope with. And it wasn't fair to kind of hide what's going on from them. So he came over and he sat down on my hospital bed with me, and he really just told me straight out. He just said, like, Siofra, you have type 1 diabetes. And he explained that, you know, my pancreas had stopped producing insulin, and therefore I would have to inject insulin. And I remember really clearly, he told me that his exact words were, "There is no such thing as a diabetes holiday." And I just, that was really, first of all, I was like, what do you mean? I don't understand. But he really made a point to me that, unfortunately, like, it is very upsetting, but you don't get a holiday from diabetes. There is no days off. You can't just not inject your insulin and everything will be okay. And I think he was trying to make really clear to me as well that, unlike what I'd kind of been seeing in TV shows and in books, you don't always leave the hospital cured. And I think that was a really big lesson for me. It was really hard actually leaving hospital and realizing, oh, wait, you don't kind of get sick, enter hospital, you're not sick anymore, and you leave. Sometimes you leave with some things.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. You went in,
yeah.
you left with more than you went in with.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, it was just very strange because I think as well, when you're at that age 10, which seems to be a very common age for people, you're old enough to understand a lot of what's happening, but you're not old enough to fully grasp what's going on either. So, I mean, I was just very scared because I knew in myself something was very wrong. I was very, very ill. But at the same time, one of my first questions was, what's a pancreas? I had never even, I don't know how I missed it up until that point, but I had no idea. I was starting from square one. So, yeah, I mean, it was funny. Like, being in hospital it was a strange experience, but I don't look upon it with nostalgia, but I don't look upon it with great negativity either. For me, I suppose because I was so ill as well, I didn't have like the headspace to even really think about what was going on. I was just trying to get better. So it was sort of strange to be in that zone. But I mean, the Sligo General Hospital, like the staff and the nurses and the doctors, they're so fantastic there that they really helped me not feel so scared. If you had any questions or need any help, you didn't feel afraid to ask. So I got a lot of support very, very early on.
And then, so you said that shortly afterwards, like it was a couple of months that you ended up being diagnosed with celiac disease as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's quite common, I think. Actually, no, I think it's like 5% or something. Like that.
Between 5 and 10% of people with type 1 have celiac disease as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was pretty immediate after I came home. We knew something was wrong again, because obviously I was still eating gluten and then I was feeling very, very sick. So like for me, my symptoms when I have gluten is I just have extreme stomach pain. So that was happening every single day. We knew something was wrong. But of course, when you go in and you get diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, very often they will then do a blood test. And one of the things they check for is celiacs, naturally. Unfortunately, my celiac test, something happened in the lab where it went missing, or something was ticked where they said, oh, she doesn't have celiacs, but I actually did have celiacs. So my diagnosis was delayed by a few months, when really I actually did have celiacs the entire time. So I ended up getting a biopsy done in Crumlin to get confirmed with celiacs. But at that stage, they had already been saying to me, right, cut back on gluten because it's most likely celiacs. And sure enough, it was.
Yeah. And how does that complicate diabetes then? Because, I mean, yeah, you're removing the gluten from your diet, but you does that mean that the foods you eat are higher in carbs, or you know what? I actually don't know how this works. So could you Educate me a little bit, please.
Yeah, I mean, celiac's actually on a day-to-day basis bothers me a lot more than diabetes. It certainly gets in the way. It often feels more, especially because I think socially it can actually be more difficult because diabetes, I can adapt around plans with my diabetes. Like if we're exercising, I know I can cut back my insulin. Whereas with celiacs, very often people want to go for food or they might spontaneously want to go for food. Whereas I can't be spontaneous. So what I find difficult socially is just when people want to go for a meal, I have to intersect and say, hey, could we maybe go to these restaurants? Or if it's like a completely new city, I have to look online and research the restaurants and look at the reviews, call them maybe, see if they have a menu. But I also need to gauge with the gluten-free fad, there's a lot more gluten-free food, but something being gluten-free isn't necessarily suitable for celiac because I need food to be gluten-free, but I also need to make sure that there wasn't cross-contamination present in the kitchen or the factory, wherever the food was made. So
Yeah.
you can have a gluten-free slice of bread, but if you put it on top of a gluten slice of bread, cross-contamination occurs and I can no longer eat that gluten-free slice of bread. So you have to place a certain amount of trust in the restaurant or the cafe, say. And obviously that's quite anxious when you're going out for a meal. It's not the most enjoyable experience sometimes. So you kind of, I would know exactly what restaurants I can eat in my hometown, you know, but it's a lot more bothersome, I find, because it means I have to cart food around me with me everywhere. If I'm going somewhere, like I went to Photo Wildlife Park last weekend for any Cork people that know what I'm talking about. But when you arrive somewhere, I just assumed there probably wouldn't be anything I could eat there. I wanted to go maybe get an ice cream because my friend was, but I walked up, it was cart door ice cream, and I knew I couldn't eat any of it. Those are the sort of things that Photo wasn't going to have on their website. So I had to carry food around with me. And with diabetes, because you may go low, have a low blood sugar, you need to make sure you have food. But it's doubly difficult because I can't just depend on running into a restaurant to get something to eat if I had a low blood sugar.
Or even a convenience shop, like a petrol station. Exactly. Or
delis, like that sort of thing is a no-go. It's just not going to happen.
And it might be okay in Ireland where the packaging is in English, but if you go to a European country, the packaging is going to be not necessarily have English on it. So okay, well, thank you for explaining that. So we have a lot to talk about in your story, even though you're one of the most recent diagnoses that I have interviewed in this series. So we're going to move on to going to school. And I mean, we want to talk about quite a bit doing exams and the DARE scheme and the special accommodations for exams. But can you tell me briefly, like, what was school like? Because obviously you were diagnosed at the beginning of a school year and then you had to go back, but your story kind of takes an unusual turn because you switched schools.
Yeah. So when I was diagnosed, it was like the third day of fourth class. And by the time I came back to school, I think it was nearly a month later. But while I was in hospital and while I was off school, because I didn't immediately go back into school when I came out of hospital, I was still having to adapt to diabetes. It was too much at once. I decided to move schools because my previous school, I never really settled in. I experienced quite a bit of bullying. So it wasn't going to be a suitable environment. When it was already a difficult environment, it wasn't going to be a good idea to walk back into that with a brand new diagnosis.
Yeah, it wasn't going to get better. It was going to get worse.
Yeah. So I decided to switch schools. So I suppose that could sound quite difficult, but at the same time, I think there was a lot of benefit to walking into a new school as, you know, the new kid, but at least there was no like the Siofra before and the Siofra after with diabetes tagged on. When I went into my new school, everyone knew me as, okay, she's got diabetes. There was no Siofra pre-diabetes. So I could kind of put a new foot forward. And I think that probably helped quite a bit in accepting diabetes as something I had, instead of kind of trying to feel like I could be this person before sort of situation. I just walked in as, yes, I'm a diabetic. Hello.
Yeah. So yeah, and thanks for that. So now we're going to talk about secondary school, and your first experience with state exams would have been the junior cert. And we talked in great detail about what you had to do for the special accommodations during exams. So can you, well, first of all, how did you know about that in advance? Well, you had to, because you had to apply for it the year before. So did the school tell you that this could be an option, or did you or your parents have to find out?
I believe it was my healthcare team actually that would have highlighted that to me, because obviously I was going to pediatrics. They had junior cert students with diabetes come through their clinic before. So I believe they were the ones that mentioned it to us that, you know, in fact, you can get some special accommodations. Because obviously having to stop during an exam to treat a low blood sugar, that's going to be extremely difficult to do in a big hall. And I had already found it very difficult because obviously schools have summer and Christmas exams, they host their own. And I was placed into a big hall for that. And so naturally, taking my blood sugar was very disruptive to my exam. So we knew, okay, state examinations, that really matters. Something's going to need to be done. And thankfully, there's accommodations put in place.
So can you tell us exactly what those accommodations are as standard? Yeah.
Like the accommodations differ between what you're qualifying with. So for example, for diabetes, I believe you were entitled to a separate room, which they call a special center, which may be like a room in your school, like it was for me, but I do believe some people may take it in a different hall. That could also be, you might be in a smaller room with 5 other students who are also needing a special center, or you could be in a room by yourself with an invigilator like I was. You're also entitled to rest breaks, which are quite strict. So it's, I believe, you get a 15-minute rest break per 1 hour of the exam. So if you have a 2-hour exam, you are entitled to 2 15-minute rest breaks.
Okay.
So I found straight away, because in the criteria, they don't necessarily say diabetes, you are entitled to these accommodations. I believe the word they use is long-term illness, something along those lines. So that's quite generic. As someone who doesn't sense her low blood sugars, and often when you have a low blood sugar, that creates another low blood sugar maybe 20 minutes later. During my first exam of the junior cert English, I quickly ran out of rest breaks. But you obviously can't continue doing an exam with rest breaks with, a low blood sugar. So very quickly we realized, right, I'm gonna not have enough rest breaks here. So I was able to apply to the Department of Education, and they granted me to have what we would call probably unlimited rest breaks. But that just meant that instead of being very strict with, okay, you can only have 1 15-minute rest break per hour, I could stop the exam if I had a low or high blood sugar and treat it for as long as I needed to. And then when my blood sugars were at a good level again, then I could resume the exam. And I mean, once I was able to switch to that accommodation, it was so much better. Like I was able to take my exams like as any person would, basically.
Okay, we are actually going to pause part 1 of our video and take up in part 2 of our interview, where we're going to talk through the process you had to go through to apply for those special accommodations. And we're going to talk about their scheme, and we're going to talk about lots more. We're going to talk about college life as well.